In 2018, authorities seized a luxury yacht called Equanimity. It wasn't just another billionaire toy. The yacht had a helicopter pad, a private cinema, a spa, multiple luxury suites, and a price tag of around $250 million. To most people, it looked like a floating palace. But investigators weren't interested in the yacht itself. They wanted to know one thing: who paid for it? The answer would eventually lead them to a missing $4.5 billion, a Hollywood movie, one of Wall Street's most powerful banks, and a fugitive businessman who vanished without a trace. At first, the yacht looked like a symbol of success. Then investigators started following the money. What they discovered was shocking. According to authorities in multiple countries, money connected to a Malaysian state investment fund had allegedly been diverted through a complex network of shell companies and bank accounts. This wasn't a small fraud. This was a scandal that would eventually involve governments, global banks, luxury assets, and criminal investigations across several continents. The scandal became known as 1MDB, short for One Malaysia Development Berhad, a Malaysian government investment fund created in 2009 to attract foreign investment, create jobs, and help grow the country's economy. At first, almost nobody outside Malaysia paid attention to it. Today, however, 1MDB is remembered as one of the biggest financial scandals ever uncovered. The story involves a prime minister, a fugitive businessman, one of Wall Street's most powerful banks, Hollywood celebrities, private jets, luxury mansions, and billions of dollars that investigators say were diverted from the fund. What makes this story so unbelievable is that it doesn't start with a criminal mastermind hiding in the shadows. It starts with people wearing expensive suits, attending business meetings, signing official documents, and talking about economic development. Everything looked professional. Everything looked legitimate. And that's exactly why so many people failed to notice what was happening until the scandal became too large to hide. At the center of the mystery stood a man named Jho Low. He wasn't officially running 1MDB. He wasn't a government minister. Yet somehow, he seemed connected to nearly every important part of the story. He attended celebrity parties, traveled on private jets, bought luxury properties, and appeared to have unlimited money. People saw the lifestyle. Very few people asked where the money came from. As investigators later followed the trail, they found something even stranger. Money allegedly linked to the scandal had connections to The Wolf of Wall Street, one of the most famous movies about greed and financial excess ever made. Think about that for a moment. A movie about financial crime was allegedly financed, in part, by money connected to a real financial scandal. Reality was starting to look more unbelievable than fiction. The deeper investigators looked, the larger the numbers became. Millions turned into hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions turned into billions. Every new discovery raised a new question. If so much money was moving through the global financial system, why didn't anyone stop it? Banks have compliance teams. Companies have auditors. Governments have regulators. Yet somehow, according to investigators, billions still moved before the full picture emerged. And that is what makes the 1MDB scandal different from most fraud stories. This isn't just about missing money. It's about trust. Trust in governments. Trust in banks. Trust in powerful institutions. Because if investigators are right, then one of the biggest questions isn't how billions disappeared. It's how so many intelligent people failed to stop it. Even today, the story isn't completely over. Years after the scandal exploded into global headlines, courts, regulators, and investigators are still dealing with its consequences. Assets are still being recovered. Lawsuits are still being settled. New developments continue appearing in 2026. The scandal has already cost billions of dollars in penalties, settlements, and losses, yet many questions remain unanswered. So how did a fund created to help a country become linked to luxury yachts, Hollywood movies, global investigations, and billions of missing dollars? Who benefited? Who knew the truth? And how did investigators eventually uncover one of the biggest financial scandals in modern history? To answer those questions, we need to go back to Malaysia in 2009. That's where the real story begins. The story begins in 2009. Malaysia had a new prime minister named Najib Razak. Like many leaders around the world, he wanted faster economic growth, more investment, and bigger development projects. Around that time, a state investment vehicle was transformed into something much larger. It became One Malaysia Development Berhad, better known as 1MDB. The official mission sounded simple: attract global investment, create jobs, and help modernize the country. To ordinary citizens, it looked like a bold plan for Malaysia's future. Few people imagined that this fund would one day become the center of one of the biggest financial scandals in modern history. At At first, everything appeared normal. Governments around the world operate investment funds. Some invest in infrastructure. Others invest in energy, technology, or real estate. 1MDB was supposed to do something similar. It would borrow money, invest wisely, and generate returns that could help the nation. On paper, the idea sounded reasonable. Investors liked it. Politicians promoted it. Financial institutions were willing to work with it. But there was one problem. From the very beginning, the fund was handling enormous amounts of money, and enormous amounts of money create enormous opportunities. Around the same time, a young businessman named Jho Low was becoming increasingly influential behind the scenes. Officially, he did not hold a senior executive position inside 1MDB. Yet, according to multiple investigations, he attended important meetings, helped connect influential people, and became involved in several major transactions linked to the fund. Years later, investigators would describe him as a central figure in the scandal. But in 2009, very few people viewed him as a future international fugitive. He looked more like a well-connected dealmaker with powerful friends. Then came one of the most important deals in the entire story. In September 2009, 1MDB announced a joint venture with a company called PetroSaudi International. The deal was presented as a major opportunity. Malaysia's new investment fund would partner with an international energy company and potentially create enormous value. To the public, it sounded like exactly the kind of ambitious investment that 1MDB had been created to pursue. The headlines were positive, the excitement was real, and almost nobody knew that this deal would later become one of the most controversial parts of the entire scandal. The numbers were huge. 1MDB committed approximately $1 billion to the joint venture. For most people, $1 billion is difficult to imagine. It's the kind of number that sounds more like fiction than reality. Yet investigators would later spend years examining where portions of that money actually went. Because according to later allegations and court proceedings, not all of it ended up where investors believed it was supposed to go. And that was the moment the first cracks began to appear beneath the surface. Here's what makes the story fascinating. At the time, there was no dramatic collapse, no emergency press conference, no obvious warning sirens. Life continued as normal. New deals were announced. New projects were discussed. Money continued moving through the system. That's often how major financial scandals work. They rarely look like scandals in real time. They look like success stories. That's why so many people fail to recognize them until years later. As 1MDB grew, so did its ambitions. The fund expanded into energy projects, real estate developments, and international partnerships. Large sums of money were borrowed. Large sums of money were spent. New announcements kept appearing. To supporters, this looked like evidence that the strategy was working. Malaysia appeared to be building something big, but critics began asking uncomfortable questions. Why was the fund accumulating so much debt? Why were some transactions so difficult to understand? And why did explanations sometimes seem more complicated than they needed to be? The complexity became part of the problem. Most people don't read hundreds of pages of financial documents. Most investors don't spend months tracing corporate structures across different countries. They rely on trust. They trust auditors. They trust banks. They trust regulators. They trust that someone else has checked the details. But when everyone assumes someone else is checking, important questions can go unanswered. And in the case of 1MDB, some of those unanswered questions were becoming increasingly expensive. Then another important player entered the story. Goldman Sachs, one of the most powerful investment banks in the world, helped arrange billions of dollars in bond offerings for 1MDB. The transactions raised massive amounts of capital and gave the fund access to even more money. To many observers, Goldman Sachs' involvement added credibility. After all, if one of the world's most respected investment banks was involved, surely everything had been carefully reviewed. At least, that's what many people assumed at the time. But while the public saw growth, investment, and opportunity, something else was happening behind the scenes. Money was beginning to move through a network of companies, accounts, and transactions that would later attract the attention of investigators around the world. Nobody knew it yet, but the stage was being set for a scandal involving luxury yachts, Hollywood movies, billion-dollar transfers, criminal trials, and one of the most wanted financial fugitives on the planet. And the deeper investigators would dig, the stranger the story would become. For years, 1MDB looked like a success story. New projects projects were announced. International partnerships were promoted. Billions of dollars flowed through the organization. But behind the headlines, investigators would later discover something alarming. Large amounts of money were moving through companies that seemed difficult to understand. Ownership structures were complicated. Transactions crossed multiple countries. And every time someone tried to follow the money, the trail became harder to see. It was as if the system had been designed to confuse anyone who looked too closely. One of the most important techniques investigators later focused on was the use of shell companies. A shell company can look like a real business on paper, while having little or no actual business activity. By moving money through multiple entities, it becomes harder to determine who controls the funds and where the money ultimately ends up. According to investigators, networks of companies played a major role in moving billions connected to the 1MB scandal, and every additional company made the picture more complicated. Imagine trying to track a single drop of water. Now imagine that drop enters a river. Then the river splits into 10 branches, then 100, then 1,000. That is similar to what financial investigators faced. Money allegedly moved through accounts in multiple countries, crossed different banking systems, and passed through numerous entities before reaching its final destination. Every transfer created more distance between the money and its original source, and that distance became one of the scandal's greatest protections. As investigators reconstructed the money trail, they noticed a pattern. Again and again, funds appeared to move toward entities linked to a small network of individuals. Luxury spending began appearing everywhere. Expensive properties were purchased. Artwork worth millions changed hands. Private jets were chartered. Massive bank accounts grew larger. The deeper authorities looked, the less the spending resembled normal investment activity, and the more it resembled extraordinary personal enrichment. Then came one of the most shocking discoveries in the entire scandal. Investigators alleged that money connected to 1MB helped fund a company called Red Granite Pictures. That company would go on to produce The Wolf of Wall Street, the blockbuster film starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Suddenly, a financial scandal in Malaysia was connected to one of Hollywood's most famous movies. The irony was impossible to ignore. A movie about greed and excess had become linked to allegations involving real-world greed and excess. The spending did not stop there. Authorities later identified luxury homes in places such as Beverly Hills, New York, London, and other prime locations. They identified artwork created by famous artists. They identified jewelry worth millions of dollars. Some assets became symbols of the scandal itself. Every new seizure seemed to reveal another example of how money allegedly diverted from a public fund had been transformed into private luxury. But perhaps nothing symbolized the scandal more than the yacht Equanimity. At roughly 300 feet long, it looked like something owned by royalty or a tech billionaire. It contained luxury suites, a spa, a swimming pool, a gym, and even a helicopter landing area. Authorities alleged that money connected to the scandal helped pay for it. When the yacht was eventually seized, it became a global headline and a visual reminder of just how much money investigators believed had been diverted. As journalists continued investigating, another mystery emerged. Why had so many warning signs been ignored? Some reporters had been raising concerns for years. Some analysts questioned transactions. Some insiders reportedly expressed concerns. Yet the machine kept moving forward. The answer may be one of the most uncomfortable lessons in finance. Success can make people less skeptical. When money is flowing and everyone appears to be winning, difficult questions often become easier to ignore. Then international investigators started connecting their evidence. Financial records from different countries were compared. Bank transfers were examined. Corporate documents were reviewed. What looked like isolated transactions began forming a larger picture. Piece by piece, investigators alleged that approximately $4.5 billion had been diverted from 1MB through multiple schemes and entities. The number was so large that it shocked financial experts around the world. This was no longer a local controversy. It had become one of the largest corruption investigations in modern history. And then the spotlight turned toward some of the most powerful institutions in global finance. Questions were no longer focused only on politicians or businessmen. Investigators wanted to understand how billions of dollars could move through the international financial financial system without triggering stronger intervention. One name appeared repeatedly in headlines, investigations, and courtroom discussions: Goldman Sachs. What happened next would transform the scandal from a story about missing money into a story about accountability at the highest levels of global finance. By the mid-2010s, the 1MDB story was becoming impossible to ignore. Journalists, investigators, and financial experts were asking increasingly difficult questions. At the center of those questions stood Goldman Sachs, one of the most powerful investment banks in the world. Between 2012 and 2013, Goldman helped raise approximately $6.5 billion for 1MDB through a series of bond offerings. The deals were completed quickly and generated unusually large fees. At the time, the transactions were celebrated as a success. Years later, they would become a major focus of international investigations. One reason the deals attracted attention was the amount Goldman Sachs earned. Reports showed that the bank received hundreds of millions of dollars in fees from the bond offerings. Critics questioned why the fees were so high. Defenders argued that the transactions involved significant risk, but as investigators uncovered more information, attention shifted away from the fees themselves and toward a much bigger question. Were warning signs missed, or were warning signs ignored? Then prosecutors began focusing on individuals. One of the most important names was Tim Leissner, a former Goldman Sachs banker who played a major role in the 1MDB deals. Eventually, Leissner admitted involvement in misconduct and cooperated with authorities. His testimony provided investigators with an inside view of how some transactions had been structured. Suddenly, this was no longer just about documents and bank transfers. Insiders were beginning to tell their side of the story. Another Goldman Sachs banker, Roger Ng, also became a central figure in the case. Prosecutors argued that key information had been concealed and that improper payments were involved in helping secure business connected to 1MDB. Court proceedings attracted international attention because they revealed how global banking, politics, and personal relationships could become deeply connected. The scandal was no longer limited to Malaysia. It had become a worldwide financial drama. Meanwhile, pressure inside Malaysia was reaching a breaking point. For years, questions surrounding 1MDB had dominated headlines. Opposition politicians demanded answers. Citizens demanded accountability. Journalists continued publishing investigations. Every new revelation seemed larger than the one before it. What began as concerns about financial management had evolved into allegations involving billions of dollars, international money laundering, and abuse of power. The political consequences were enormous. Prime Minister Najib Razak, who had once presented 1MDB as a symbol of economic progress, now found himself at the center of intense scrutiny. Supporters defended him. Critics accused him of failing to stop what investigators described as massive wrongdoing. The controversy transformed Malaysian politics and became one of the most important issues in the country's modern history. Trust in institutions was being tested like never before. Then the man at the center of the mystery vanished. As investigators closed in and headlines spread across the world, Jho Low disappeared. No dramatic arrest, no public statement, no courtroom appearance. One of the most wanted men in international finance simply vanished. Reports placed him in different countries. Rumors spread constantly. Yet years later, authorities still had not brought him into custody. The deeper investigators looked, the more mysterious his disappearance became. For investigators, Jho Low represented one of the biggest unanswered questions. How had someone with no formal leadership role inside 1MDB allegedly gained so much influence? How had he become connected to billion-dollar transactions, luxury assets, Hollywood projects, and international financial networks? Every investigation seemed to point back toward him. Yet years later, he remained beyond the reach of law enforcement, turning him into one of the world's most famous financial fugitives. As evidence accumulated, governments across multiple countries launched actions to recover assets linked to the scandal. Authorities seized luxury homes, bank accounts, artwork, jewelry, and the famous yacht Equanimity. Billions of dollars worth of assets became the target of recovery efforts. It was one of the largest asset recovery campaigns ever attempted in a financial crime investigation. Every recovered asset represented another piece of a puzzle investigators had spent years trying to solve. By this point, the scandal had become far bigger than 1MDB itself. It had become a warning about how complex financial systems can be exploited. It had become a warning about what happens when transparency disappears. And it had become a warning about the dangers of assuming that success automatically means legitimacy. But the story still wasn't over. Even after the arrests, investigations, asset seizures, and political fallout, one final question remained unanswered. What lessons should the world learn from 1MDB? By the time the dust began to settle, the 1MDB scandal had become far more than a Malaysian political controversy. It had evolved into one of the largest financial crime investigations ever conducted. According to U.S. authorities, approximately $4.5 billion was allegedly diverted from the fund through a complex network of transactions, shell companies, and offshore accounts. Investigators across multiple countries spent years tracing the money, recovering assets, and building cases against individuals connected to the scandal. What began as a development fund had become a global lesson in how financial systems can be exploited. The consequences continued long after the headlines faded. Goldman Sachs paid billions in penalties and settlements related to the scandal over the years. Even in 2026, the fallout was still generating major legal developments. In May 2026, Goldman Sachs agreed to pay $500 million to settle a shareholder lawsuit connected to its involvement with 1MDB. Think about that for a moment. A scandal that began more than a decade earlier was still costing one of Wall Street's most powerful institutions hundreds of millions of dollars. Meanwhile, authorities continued recovering assets linked to the scandal. Luxury homes, artwork, jewelry, bank accounts, and real estate remained targets of recovery efforts. In 2026, a New York luxury condominium connected to the wider asset recovery investigation was ordered forfeited as authorities continued pursuing funds tied to the scheme. Years later, investigators were still following the money. That alone shows the extraordinary scale of what happened. And then there is Jho Low, the man who never officially ran 1MDB, the man investigators repeatedly identified as a central figure in the movement of billions of dollars. Years after the scandal exploded, he remained a fugitive. Reports in 2026 revealed that he had sought a presidential pardon in the United States while continuing to deny wrongdoing. Yet, despite countless investigations, documentaries, court cases, and headlines, one mystery remains unsolved. Where exactly is Jho Low? And what information does he still possess about one of the biggest financial scandals in modern history? Remember the promise that started 1MDB, a fund created to help build Malaysia's future, a fund designed to attract investment, create jobs, and improve lives. Years later, investigators alleged that billions of dollars connected to that promise had instead funded luxury yachts, Hollywood movies, private jets, mansions, artwork, and extravagant lifestyles around the world. The money trail stretched across continents. Governments launched investigations. Banks paid billions in penalties. Careers were destroyed. Reputations collapsed. Yet one question still remains. If billions of dollars could move through governments, banks, auditors, regulators, and some of the most powerful institutions on Earth before the truth emerged, what other financial stories are we accepting today simply because the people telling them seem too powerful to question?